My dad has a bike just like yours, but he hasn't touched it in years. Those 12 words, spoken by a tired waitress holding a coffee pot in the middle of a Nevada nowhere diner. And the moment she said them, the biggest, most feared man at the table put his cup down so slowly it made no sound at all. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, every single word of this matters. The diner was called Lou's. Nobody really knew who Lou was anymore. The sign out front had lost its apostrophe sometime in the 90s, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Lou's, like it belonged to all of them and none of them at the same time. It sat off Highway 93, like something the desert had coughed up and forgotten about. A low building with a gravel lot, two ceiling fans that only worked when they felt like it, and a pie case up front that always looked more hopeful than the pies themselves deserved. Emily Carter had been working the morning shift at Lou's for 3 years. She wasn't proud of it. She wasn't ashamed of it either. It was just the thing she did between waking up and going back to sleep, and lately those two events didn't feel all that different from each other. She was 31, though on bad days she felt 50. Her hair was pulled back tight, the kind of tight that meant she'd stopped caring whether it looked good and only cared whether it stayed out of her face. She had her mother's eyes. Everyone who had known her mother said so, and she had stopped finding that comforting a long time ago. It was a Tuesday. That mattered because Tuesdays at Lou's were usually quiet enough that Emily could refill the same 3 coffee cups for 2 hours and think about nothing. Think about everything. There was almost no difference. She heard them before she saw them. The sound came from outside, low rolling like thunder that had decided to stay at ground level. Multiple engines, not one. The gravel lot popped and crunched under tires, and the whole building seemed to inhale and hold it. The cook, a heavy-set man named Terrence, who rarely spoke before 10 in the morning, leaned out from the kitchen window and said, "You see how many?" Emily looked out the front window. She counted 8 bikes, big ones, American iron, and all of them chrome, catching the flat morning light. The riders were already dismounting, moving with that particular unhurried confidence that told you they had never once in their lives worried about whether they were welcome somewhere. 8, she said. Terrence pulled back into the kitchen. "I'll start another pot." They came through the door in a loose group and filled the diner the way weather fills a room, suddenly completely changing the pressure of everything. They wore their cuts, the leather vests with the patches that said exactly who they were to anyone paying attention. Most people in that diner, a retired couple near the window, a trucker alone at the counter, paid attention, and then quickly paid attention somewhere else. Emily didn't flinch. She had grown up around motorcycles. She knew what a cut meant, and she also knew that the men wearing them were still men. They wanted coffee and eggs, and they wanted to be left to their own business. She grabbed the pot and walked over. "Morning," she said. "Coffee to start." The one who seemed to be in charge looked up at her. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a face that had been lived in hard and put away rough, deep lines around his eyes, a jaw like a shelf gray, threaded through a beard that had seen better days and didn't seem to care. He had the kind of stillness about him that you either respected or feared depending on who you were. His patch said Jake. Below that in smaller letters, Stone. "Yeah," he said. "Coffee, all around." She started pouring. The men settled in. There was conversation among them, quiet, low, the kind between people who had known each other long enough that they didn't need volume. She caught fragments. Route. Weather system coming. Something about a guy named Reeves who owed someone something. Normal enough. She came back with menus, and Jake Stone ordered, without looking at one. Eggs, bacon, wheat toast, no butter. She wrote it down. The man to his left, younger, maybe early 40s, with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, asked for the same. One by one, she went around the table, and one by one they ordered, and she wrote it all down and carried it back to Terrence, who had in fact already started the eggs. It was on her second pass with the coffee pot that had happened. She was refilling Stone's cup. He had barely touched it. She noticed he was one of those people who ordered coffee as a social act and then just let it sit when her eyes moved to the bike visible through the front window. His bike. It was parked closest to the door, a little ahead of the others, the way a lead dog walks. Dark blue, almost black in certain light. A specific model. A specific year. She knew because her father had the same one sitting in a garage 60 miles north of here, under a tarp that hadn't moved in over a decade. She said it before she thought about it. That was the honest truth of it. It wasn't a calculated thing. It wasn't an attempt to start a conversation. It just came out the way things do when your guard is down and your brain and your mouth stop consulting each other. My dad has a bike just like yours, she said, nodding toward the window. But he hasn't touched it in years. Stone set his coffee cup down. Not fast, not dramatically. He set it down the way a man sets something down when his body has just received information his mind hasn't finished processing yet. Slow, careful, like the cup had suddenly become fragile. He looked at her, really looked at her, not the quick assessing look men sometimes gave her at the diner, not the kind that calculated and dismissed. This was different. This was the look of a man trying to locate something. What kind of bike, he said. She told him the make and model and year. Something moved through the table. She felt it more than saw it, a shift in posture, an exchange of glances, a stillness that was different from the comfortable stillness of before. The man with the scar had stopped chewing. That's pretty specific, Stone said. His voice was neutral, but his eyes weren't. Your dad ride long. Long time ago, Emily said. He was serious about it. Had a whole group of guys he rode with. She gave a small shrug, the kind that tried to be casual about something that wasn't. But that was before. He doesn't really do much of anything now. Before what? Stone asked. And here was the thing she almost didn't answer. She had a rule at the diner, the same rule most people who worked in diners developed after the first year: don't tell customers your real life. Give them the surface, keep the rest. It was safer, cleaner. You didn't have to watch their faces while they decided how sorry to feel for you. But something about the way he was looking at her made the rule feel thin. Before my mom died, she said, 11 years ago, car accident. He just kind of stopped after that. Stopped writing, stopped going out, stopped most things. She forced a small, practiced smile that didn't reach anything. You know how it is. Stone said nothing. The man with the scar, she would learn later, his name was Roy Rode, named Crow, and he had been riding with Stone for going on 20 years. Roy put his fork down, set it down beside his plate with a precision that seemed intentional, like he was buying himself time. What's your dad's name? Stone asked. His voice had dropped just slightly, not threatening, something else, something she couldn't name. Emily looked at him. Why? A fair question, a natural question. She was a waitress in a diner on a Tuesday morning, and this man was asking her father's name with an expression that had changed in a way she couldn't fully read. Humor me, Stone said. She held his gaze for a second. 2. Then Daniel. Daniel Carter. The silence that followed was not like the silences that had come before it. It was not the comfortable silence of men eating breakfast. It was not the polite silence of strangers being strangers. It was the silence of something underground moving. Stone sat back in his chair. Crow looked at him. A fast look, sharp, the kind that asked a question with words. Stone's jaw tightened, then loosened, like he was working something over. Daniel Carter, he said, not a question. He said it the way you say a name you've said inside your own head so many times that hearing it out loud in someone else's voice feels wrong. Like a song in the wrong key. Yeah, Emily said slowly. She was watching him now, the way you watch something you're not sure about. Do you know him? Stone looked at her for a long moment, long enough that it stopped being comfortable. How far north, he said. Sorry. You said he lives north of here. How far? Emily felt the back of her neck do something. Not fear exactly, more like the physical version of a question mark. Why do you want to know that, Emily? He had read her name tag. He said her name simply without performance. My name is Jake Walker. 15 years ago, your father and I rode together, out of Reno. He paused, for a long time. The coffee pot in her hand felt suddenly heavy. He never mentioned, I know, Jake said. He wouldn't have. Crow was still watching Jake with that careful measuring look. The rest of the table had gone quiet in the way that told her they were all listening, even though none of them were looking. Why wouldn't he? Emily asked. Jake picked up his coffee cup again, drank from it this time, set it back down. Because the way things ended between us, that's not something a man brags about. Emily set the coffee pot on the edge of the table. She crossed her arms without realizing she'd done it, a self-protective thing, a closing in. What does that mean? It means we left, Jake said. Flat, no softening. When he needed us, we weren't there, and I've had to live with that. Something turned over in Emily's chest. He lost his wife, she said, and she could hear the edge in her own voice, the way it came out quiet but not soft. He was falling apart, and you, his brothers, you just left. Jake didn't defend himself. He didn't look away either. He met her eyes and took it. Yes, he said. It was that simple answer, not an excuse, not an explanation, just a plain yes that undid her slightly. She had expected a story, a reason, some architecture of justification that she could pick apart. The nakedness of yes took her off balance. I don't understand, she said. Why are you telling me this? Because you brought him up, Jake said, and because I haven't heard his name out loud in years. He paused. And because you're standing here looking like someone who's been carrying something heavy for a long time by herself, and maybe that's not entirely unrelated to what I just told you. Emily stared at him. Crow finally spoke, and his voice was rougher than Jake's, less careful. How is he? Is he okay? Define okay, Emily said. Nobody answered that. He's alive, she said. He lives in the house I grew up in. He gets up every day. He eats. He watches television. He calls me on Sundays. She stopped, started again. He's been disappearing for 11 years, and I don't know how to make him stop. The table was so quiet she could hear the ceiling fans struggling above them. He ever talk about us? Roy Crow asked. No, Emily said. Never. I didn't even know he had. She caught herself. He told me he rode when he was younger. He didn't talk about people. He just talked about the riding. Jake nodded slowly, like that tracked. Like that sounded like the Daniel Carter he knew. He saved my life, Jake said. Emily blinked. What? 11 years ago, just before he stopped, recalibrated, before everything happened with your mom, he did something for me that I should have done for myself. He took on something that wasn't his to take on because I wasn't strong enough to handle it. And then everything went sideways, and instead of showing up for him after, Jake's voice didn't break, it didn't waver. But it changed in a way that was harder to describe. It became very careful, the way a voice gets when a man is controlling something. We convinced ourselves he needed space. That's what we told each other. He needs space. Give him time. We'll reach out when things calm down. Things never calm down, Emily said quietly. No, Jake said. They don't. She uncrossed her arms. She didn't know she was going to ask the next question until it was already leaving her mouth. What are you going to do with this? Jake looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Crow. Some kind of wordless conversation happened between them, the kind built from years of shared miles and shared silence. He looked back at her. What's the address? I'm not. She shook her head. I don't know you. He doesn't know you're here. I'm not going to just give a stranger. Call him, Jake said. Right now, tell him who's here. See what he says. Emily looked at him. She looked at the table of men around him, all watching her with varying degrees of stillness and weight. She thought about her father in that house. She thought about the garage with the tarp. She thought about Sunday phone calls that lasted 7 minutes and covered nothing. And if he says no, she asked, then we eat our breakfast, Jake said. We pay the check, we leave, and you never see us again. She stood there for another moment. The coffee pot was getting cold in her hand. Terrence was probably watching from the kitchen window. She took out her phone. She dialed. It rang 4 times. It always rang 4 times. Her father had never once picked up before the 4th ring, as if he needed that long to decide whether the world outside was worth answering. Emmy? His voice rough from disuse, the voice of a man who maybe hadn't spoken to anyone yet that morning. Everything all right? Yeah, Dad, I'm at work. She turned slightly away from the table. Not far enough. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. A pause. Okay. Do you know someone named Jake Walker, road named Stone, from Reno? The silence on the other end of the line was different from any silence she'd heard from him before. It was not the tired silence of a man half present. It was alive. It was sharp. She heard him breathe. Where did you hear that name? He said. His voice had changed. Something had come into it, something old. Something she hadn't heard before and couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not exactly. More like the sound of a door that had been shut for a very long time being touched from the other side. He's here, she said, at the diner. He's sitting 10 feet from me. Another silence. Longer. He's asking for your address, Dad. Emily. I'm not giving it to him without your permission. I told him that. But he says, she stopped, lowered her voice slightly. He says you saved his life. He says he owes you something. She heard her father breathe in, breathe out. He say anything else? He said he left when he shouldn't have. He didn't make excuses. She glanced back at Jake, who was watching her with his hands flat on the table waiting. He just said yes. Her father was quiet for a long time, long enough that she checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Dad. When he spoke, his voice was different again, quieter, worn down to something underneath all the layers. Tell him I live on Route 7, her father said. Blue mailbox. He'll know the turnoff. He hung up. Emily stood there for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she turned back to the table. Jake was watching her, not moving, not pressing. Route 7, she said. Blue mailbox. Jake nodded once. He said you'd know the turnoff. Something crossed Jake's face, not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of one. The ghost of something, recognition maybe. The specific private kind. He reached into the inside pocket of his cut and put some bills on the table, more than the meal cost, significantly more, though he didn't make anything of it. He stood up. All of them stood up, the sound of chairs on the linoleum floor, a small percussion. At the door he stopped, turned back to her. How long has he had that tarp on the bike? Emily thought about it. 11 years, she said, maybe 12. Jake's expression didn't change, but his eyes did something move through them, brief and heavy. Something that looked a lot like the specific kind of grief that belongs to people who know exactly how something was lost and when and why, and have to live with that knowledge every single day. We'll take care of it, he said. Then they were gone. The sound of 8 engines starting was a sound she would not forget for the rest of her life, not because it was loud, though it was, but because of what it meant. Because somewhere 60 miles north, in a house that had been quiet for over a decade, a phone had just changed everything. She stood at the window and watched them pull out of the lot and roll north on 93, and she thought about her father sitting in his house right now, having just told a group of men he hadn't spoken to in 15 years exactly where to find him. She thought about what that cost him. She thought about what it meant that he'd done it. She thought about the bike under the tarp. Terrence appeared at her shoulder. Those your breakfast people? Yeah. They leave a good tip. She looked at the table, looked at the bills. Yeah, she said. They did. Terrence grunted and went back to the kitchen. Emily stood at the window a moment longer, watching the empty highway. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went back to work because the retired couple by the window needed refills, and the trucker at the counter was reading something on his phone, and the diner was still the diner, and the world still turned. But something had shifted on its axis. She could feel it. She just didn't know yet how far it would go. The 60 miles between Lou's Diner and Route 7 felt longer than they were. Jake rode at the front and said nothing. That was the thing about Stone that every man behind him knew. When he went quiet like this, really quiet, not the easy silence of open road, but the locked down quiet of a man working something over in his chest, you didn't interrupt it. You just rode and you waited and you let him get there on his own. Crow pulled up beside him at a long, straight stretch and glanced over. Jake didn't look back. His eyes were on the road, but Crow had known him long enough to know his eyes weren't really on the road at all. Crow fell back. Behind them, a younger member named Travis, 26, barely 2 years patched in, still learning when to speak and when to shut up, leaned toward the man riding beside him, a barrel-chested veteran named Boyd, and said over the engine noise, "Who's Daniel Carter?" Boyd didn't answer right away. He rode another quarter mile. Then, "Before your time." "But who is he?" Boyd looked at him with an expression that ended the conversation. "Before your time." Travis shut up. The truth was that even among the men who had been there, Daniel Carter was a name that lived in a particular cabinet in the back of the mind, the kind, is there the kind you walk past every day, the kind you never open because You know what's inside it, and you know it won't feel good. 15 years is a long time, long enough to build a life around an absence, long enough to mistake avoidance for acceptance. Jake had not mistaken it. He'd known the difference the whole time. He just hadn't known what to do with the difference until a blonde waitress in a diner in the middle of nowhere said 12 words over a coffee pot and broke the cabinet open. He saw the blue mailbox before he consciously registered looking for it. He slowed, signaled, turned. The gravel drive was long and the house at the end of it was small. And the first thing Jake noticed, the very first thing, was that the garage door was closed. Of course it was. He didn't know why he'd expected anything different, but he'd thought about that bike for 15 years, and somehow in all that thinking, he'd never imagined it behind a closed door. He'd imagined it outside. He'd imagined it running. He stopped his engine. One by one, the others stopped behind him. The silence that replaced the engines was enormous out here, the kind of silence that only exists in the desert where there's nothing for sound to bounce off of. Just the wind and the gravel settling, and somewhere a bird doing something indifferent. Nobody moved. Then Crow said quietly, "You want to go up alone?" Jake looked at the front door of the house. "No," he said. "I've done enough things alone." He got off the bike. He walked to the door and he knocked. 3 times, not hard, not soft. The knock of a man who knows he might not be welcome, but who is going to stand there either way. Silence. He knocked again. "I hear you." The voice came from inside, muffled through the door. Low, rough. The voice of a man who had been sitting in a quiet house and had heard 8 motorcycles come up his drive and had spent the last 30 seconds deciding something. "Give me a minute." Jake stepped out, put his hands in his jacket pockets. Waited. Crow was standing a few feet behind him. The rest of the men had formed a loose half circle without anyone telling them to, not aggressive, not staged, just present. 8 men standing in a gravel drive on a Tuesday morning because a waitress said 12 words. The door opened. Daniel Carter looked at Jake Walker for the first time in 15 years. He was 63 now. He had been 48 the last time Jake had seen him, and Jake had been expecting the difference. It expected the gray hair, the extra weight, the face that had been worked on by time, the way hands get worked on by years of physical labor. He had expected all of that. He had not expected the stillness. Not Stone's kind of stillness, not the stillness of a man at rest inside himself. The stillness of a man who had stopped moving a long time ago and let everything else stop with him. Like a watch that wasn't broken, just unwound. They looked at each other. "Emily called ahead," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. "She gave me the address," Jake said. "I know, I told her to." Daniel's eyes moved past Jake to the men behind him. He scanned the group slowly, deliberately, the way a man reads something he's been trying not to read for years. His jaw shifted. Something worked through his face that was not quite emotion and not quite the absence of it. Something in between. "You brought the whole circus." "We were already riding together, it didn't." "I'm not complaining." Daniel's voice came out flat. He leaned against the door frame, his arms crossed over his chest. "So, what is this?" Jake took a breath. "This is us showing up." "Oh, 15 years late." "Yes." The word landed the way Jake meant it, to straight, no cushion. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not softened, shifted, like he'd been braced for an excuse and the absence of one had caught him slightly off balance. "You'd better come in," Daniel said. He turned and walked inside and left the door open behind him. Jake looked at Crow. Crow gave a small nod. Jake went in. Crow followed. The rest of the men waited in the drive. Boyd quietly told Travis to sit down and stop looking around like a tourist, and Travis sat on the front step of his bike and looked at the sky instead. Inside, Daniel had gone to the kitchen. Jake could hear him moving around, the specific sounds of someone making coffee. They weren't entirely sure they wanted to make for someone they weren't entirely sure they wanted to have in their house. Cabinet, cups. The particular controlled noise of a man keeping his hands busy so he doesn't have to look at you. Jake stood in the middle of the room. He didn't look around. He looked at the back of Daniel's head. Crow stood near the door. "You look the same," Daniel said without turning around. "Which isn't fair." "I don't feel the same," Jake said. "None of us feel the same." Daniel turned around then. He had 2 cups. He put one on the table and left it there without looking at where Jake was standing, which meant Jake had to walk to it. A small assertion of control. Jake understood it. He walked to it. "Sit down," Daniel said. They sat. Crow stayed standing near the door, which was the right choice, present enough to be there, back enough to not be in the middle of it. Daniel wrapped both hands around his cup. He looked at Jake the way someone looks at a thing they've spent years imagining and are now recalibrating against reality. "She tell you anything?" he asked. "Emily." "She told me about Carol," Jake said carefully. Daniel's hands tightened on the cup, just slightly. "Yeah. I'm sorry, Daniel. I am. I know it doesn't do anything from here, but I am." "We sent flowers," Daniel said. His voice had gone flat again, the way it goes flat when a man is covering something with neutrality. "Right after. You remember that the club sent flowers?" "I remember." "Flowers." Daniel almost laughed. It came out wrong, not a laugh, something that had the shape of one and none of the warmth. 14 years of brotherhood, and we send flowers. Jake said nothing. "I waited," Daniel said. And this was the thing. The word waited came out of him differently from everything else. It came out stripped. No edge, no armor, just the bare fact of it. "I waited for someone to show up. Not flowers, not a card. I waited for someone to come through the door and sit with me. For a week, 2 weeks, a month." He looked at his cup. "Nobody came. I know." "Why?" It was a simple question. Direct. Not angry or not only angry. It was a question that had been sitting inside a man for 15 years, waiting for someone to finally be in the room to receive it. "Why didn't anyone come?" Jake held the question. He didn't try to answer it fast. He knew the fast answer would be the wrong one. "Because I was a coward," he said finally. "Because showing up would have meant looking at what you were going through and knowing I was part of why it was worse than it needed to be, and I wasn't ready to do that. So I told myself you needed space. I told myself you'd reach out when you were ready. I told myself a lot of things, Daniel. None of them were true. They were just things I told myself so I wouldn't have to knock on your door." The kitchen was quiet. "What do you mean you were part of why it was worse?" Daniel asked. Slow, careful, like he already knew but needed it said. "The situation with Reeves," Jake said. "Before Carol's accident, you took the fall for me. You took something that was mine to handle and you put it on yourself because I wasn't standing up the way I should have been. And the blowback from that, the trouble it caused you, the people it put on your back, I don't know what that cost you in those last months with Carol. I don't know if it made things harder between you two. I don't know what she knew or what she had to carry because of something that was my fault." Daniel went very still. "I never knew if I was the reason things were strained between you when she died," Jake said. "I never knew if you died inside a little faster because things were already difficult, and if that difficulty had my name on it somewhere. I couldn't face that. I couldn't sit with you and look you in the eye and not know if I had contributed to your worst pain." He stopped. His voice was steady but barely. "That's not an excuse, that's a confession." Daniel didn't move for a long time. Then he put his cup down. "She knew," he said. His voice had changed again, lower, something fundamental exposed in it. "Carol knew about what I did for you. I told her. We fought about it. We fought about it bad." He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "And then 3 weeks later, she was gone. And the last real conversation we had was a fight about you." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that has weight, physical weight. Jake felt it on his shoulders. "I didn't know that," Jake said. "No," Daniel said. "You didn't." He looked at Jake, then really looked at him, and for the first time there was something in it beyond the flatness. There was grief there, raw and old, and still very much alive. "I have hated you for that, in the way you hate someone when hating them is easier than missing them. You understand that?" "Yes," Jake said. "I hated all of you, the whole club, because it was easier to hate you than to sit in this house alone and admit that I was just a man whose wife died and whose friends disappeared and who had no idea what to do with any of it." Crow made a sound near the door. Not a word, just a sound. The kind men make when something hits somewhere it shouldn't. "Daniel," Jake said. "Don't." Daniel held up one hand, not aggressive, protective. "Don't do the thing where you try to fix it right now. Don't give me a speech. I've had 11 years of silence, and I can handle another minute of it. Jake closed his mouth. They sat there. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the faint sound of wind across the gravel. And then Daniel did something unexpected. He laughed, a real one this time. Short, rough, reluctant, the laugh of a man who has just heard the absurdity of his own life, stated out loud and found it against all reason slightly funny. He shook his head. My daughter, he said. She's been trying to get me to talk to a therapist for 3 years. I told her I was fine. She told me I wasn't. He looked at Jake. And then she goes to work one Tuesday morning and accidentally starts the conversation I should have had 15 years ago with a coffee pot. She's perceptive, Jake said. She's her mother's daughter, Daniel said. And the way he said it, quiet, certain, with something private and complete in it, told Jake more about 11 years of grief than anything else in the room. A pause, then Daniel asked, the others outside, who'd you bring? Crow, Boyd, Travis, few others. Daniel's expression shifted. Travis, that's not Tommy Travis's kid. Nephew. Daniel stared at him. Tommy's been gone, 6 years? 7. 7 years. Daniel sat with that. And his nephew's patched in. He's good, Jake said. Earnest, rides clean. Tommy was the best of us, Daniel said. You know that? I know. He would have showed up, Daniel said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was just true. Tom would have been at my door inside a week. You're right, Jake said. He would have. Another silence. Different from the others, this one a little softer around the edges. The kind that comes when two people have said the hardest things and are now just breathing in the same room. What do you want, Jake? Daniel asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Not what you think you owe me. What do you actually want from being here? Jake thought about it honestly, the way you think about things when the person asking you deserves a real answer. I want to know you're still in there somewhere, he said. The Daniel Carter I rode with for 14 years. The man who told me it once that the road was the only place he ever felt completely himself. He looked at the door that presumably led to the garage. The man whose bike is under a tarp out there. Daniel followed his gaze. His expression changed in a way that was hard to name something complicated. A compound thing, grief and resistance, and something underneath both of them that might have been hunger if you looked at it the right way. The bike's not going anywhere, Daniel said. Neither are we, Jake said. Daniel looked at him, then at Crow. Crow met his eyes with the simple steadiness of a man who meant what his presence said and nothing more. You hungry? Daniel asked abruptly. Jake blinked. What? Are you hungry? I've got eggs. I've got bread. Daniel stood up, went to the refrigerator. I'm not going to sit here and have a feelings conversation on an empty stomach like some kind of afternoon talk show. Crow made a sound that might have been a laugh. Yeah, Jake said slowly. We're hungry. Go tell the others to come in then, Daniel said, already pulling things from the refrigerator with his back turned. I'm not feeding 8 men through a closed door. Jake looked at Crow. Crow raised both eyebrows. Jake went to the door, opened it, looked at the 7 men sitting in the drive, some on bikes, Boyd on the front step, Travis standing now and looking vaguely anxious the way young men do when they feel the weight of something they don't fully understand. He's making eggs, Jake said. Boyd stared at him. He's making eggs. Come in. Boyd stood up slowly. Travis looked at him. Boyd said quietly, don't say one wrong thing. Don't ask one wrong question. You eat, you listen, you learn. You got it. Travis nodded. They filed in. Daniel Carter cooked eggs for 8 men he hadn't seen in 15 years and didn't say much while he did it. But he didn't say nothing either. He asked Boyd about his knee. Boyd had broken it badly on a run outside Flagstaff back in the day, and the fact that Daniel remembered it made Boyd go quiet for a second, in a way he tried to cover by looking for a place to sit. He asked Crow how his mother was. Crow said she'd passed 2 years ago. Daniel stopped what he was doing for just a second, didn't turn around, said, I'm sorry, Roy. Not Crow, Roy, the name under the road name, the name from before all of it. Crow said thank you and pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling. He did not ask about the situation with Reeves. He did not ask about anything that had happened in the years since. There was a structure to what Daniel was and wasn't asking, and every man in that kitchen understood it intuitively. They were being let back in one room at a time. The whole house was not open. Just this room. Just today. It was enough. They ate. They talked careful at first, then less careful the way people get when food is in front of them and the worst has already been said. Someone told a story about a run 2 summers ago that went sideways outside of Barstow. Boyd told it badly and Crow corrected him, and Boyd told him to tell it himself then, and Crow did, and the story was better when Crow told it, and somewhere in the middle of Crow's version, Daniel made a sound. A small sound. The beginning of a laugh that he caught and held but couldn't completely stop. Nobody made a big deal of it, but Jake heard it, and Jake filed it away in a different cabinet, the kind you keep specifically for evidence that a person is still alive inside themselves. When the plates were nearly empty and the coffee pot had gone around twice, Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Not the look of a man thinking, the look of a man arriving somewhere. "I dreamed about that bike last week," he said. Nobody responded. They let it sit. "First time in years," he said. "Dreamed I was on it. Out on 95, that long, flat stretch going north. You know the one, Jake, where the mountain comes up on the left and looks like it's painted on?" "I know it," Jake said. "In the dream it was running perfect," Daniel said. "No sound except the engine and the road." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I woke up and it was just the house. The table was very still. I don't know if it'll even start anymore," he said. It wasn't directed at anyone. He was just saying it, working it out in the open air for the first time. 11 years is a long time to let an engine sit. "Engines can be woken up," Jake said carefully. Daniel looked at him. "That a metaphor?" "It's an observation," Jake said. "Metaphor is your call." Daniel looked at the door to the garage. He looked at it for long enough that it meant something. "Not today," he said. "Okay," Jake said. I'm not ready for that today." "Okay," Jake said again. Same tone, no pressure, no disappointment in it. Just a man hearing another man's truth and choosing to accept it without making it into something it didn't need to be. Daniel looked at him. Something in his face was working, moving, trying to settle into a shape. "You meant what you said?" he asked. "Out in the drive that you're not leaving again." "Yes," Jake said. "Because I need you to mean that," Daniel said. And this was the thing that cut through every wall in the room. The simple nakedness of it. Not a plea, not a demand, just a man saying the true thing after 15 years of not saying it. "I'm not built to do this alone anymore. I can't afford to let someone back in and have them disappear again. I'm not 20 years younger. I don't bounce back the way I used to." "Daniel," Jake leaned forward, elbows on the table, looked him straight in the eyes with everything unguarded. "I drove 60 miles on a Tuesday because a girl with your eyes told me you had a bike under a tarp. I'm not going anywhere." Daniel held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Slow. The nod of a man who is deciding to believe something, even though believing things has cost him before. "All right," he said. Outside, the wind had picked up. The bikes in the drive shifted and settled. Travis, who had been silent for the entire meal exactly as Boyd had told him to be, looked around the table at these men who shared a history he could only see the edges of and understood for the first time what it actually meant to be part of something that lasted. Boyd caught him looking and gave him the smallest nod. And in the kitchen of a small house on Route 7, with the garage door still closed and the tarp still on the bike, and 11 years still heavy in the air, 8 men and 1 grieving father sat around a table and began slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantee of how it would go to find their way back to each other. They stayed longer than any of them had planned. That was the thing nobody had said out loud when they pulled out of Lou's parking lot that morning. Nobody had said how long this was going to take. Nobody had drawn a line in the sand and said, "We'll give him an hour and then we ride." They had all just assumed it would be short. Uncomfortable, a conversation that needed to happen and would happen, and then they would leave, and Daniel would have the rest of the day to sit with it, and they would have the road back to process it. That's not what happened. They stayed through the afternoon. They stayed through the light changing outside and the coffee pot emptying a third time. Travis fell asleep in the chair by the wall, and nobody woke him because Boyd said with great authority that the kid had been riding since 4 in the morning and deserved it. And Daniel looked at the sleeping 26-year-old and said nothing but brought a blanket from the hall closet and dropped it over him without ceremony And Jake watched him do it and thought about the kind of man who still does that, who still covers a sleeping kid with a blanket without being asked, and understood that Daniel Carter had not disappeared entirely. He had just gone underground. He was still in there, under everything. It was late afternoon when Jake's phone buzzed. He looked at it, set it face down. Daniel noticed. "You need to be somewhere." "No," Jake said. "Somebody needs something from you." "It can wait." Daniel looked at him for a moment. "You always did do that," he said. "Someone would call, you'd look at the phone like it owed you an apology, then turn it over." Jake almost smiled. "Old habit." "Carol used to call it your disappearing act," Daniel said. He said her name naturally, the way you say the name of someone you've been thinking about constantly, with ease and with weight at the same time. Then he seemed to hear himself say it, and something shifted in his face. He looked at his hands. "She said you were the most present person she knew, except for when technology reminded you the world existed." The table got quiet the way it does when someone says something that opens a door neither person was fully prepared to walk through. "She was funny," Jake said carefully. "She was the funniest person I've ever known," Daniel said. "I don't tell people that. People think when you lose someone, you just talk about how kind they were, how strong, how good. Carol was all of those things. But the thing I miss most, the thing I actually ache for most on the bad days, is that I can't make her laugh anymore." His voice stayed steady, but something underneath it was not. "I knew exactly how to make her laugh. I'd spent 30 years learning it, and now there's nobody to use it on." Crow across the table put his coffee down. "I'm sorry," Boyd said quietly. He wasn't a man who said things like that easily, and everyone at the table knew it, which was why it landed the way it did. Daniel nodded, accepted it, moved on in the way grief sometimes lets you move on, not away from it, just past the moment of it, stepping over it, like something on the floor, so you can keep walking. "Emily looks like her," Daniel said. "Every year more so. Sometimes she'll say something, the exact cadence of it, the way she builds to a sentence, and I have to look out the window for a second. It's not bad, I want to be clear. It's not bad, it's the best thing in my life." He looked at Jake directly. "She's the best thing in my life. She doesn't know how hard I work to not let her see me falling apart." "No, she knows," Jake said. Daniel looked at him. "She told me this morning," Jake said, "at the diner. She said you've been disappearing for 11 years, and she doesn't know how to make you stop. She said that, Daniel, out loud to a stranger because she's been carrying it alone." Daniel was very still. "She's protecting you," Jake said, "the same way you're protecting her. And in between the two of you protecting each other, neither one of you is actually talking." Something crossed Daniel's face, a sharp thing, the kind that comes when a truth arrives too fast to defend against. His jaw tightened. He looked away, and Jake watched him work through it in real time. The resistance first, the instinct to push back, and then beneath that, the slower arrival of recognition. The admission, even if only to himself. "She should have told me she was," he started. "She shouldn't have had to," Jake said gently. "She's your daughter. She should be able to fall apart in front of you without worrying it'll break you." The silence that followed that was long and full, and Daniel Carter sat inside it like a man sitting inside a room he had walked past for years, and finally opened the door of and found that it was smaller than he'd built it up to be in his imagination. Smaller and more survivable. "When did you get wise?" Daniel said finally. "I got older," Jake said. "Turns out they're different things, but they overlap sometimes." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. A long, slow gesture. The gesture of a man resurfacing. Then he stood up. He walked to the door of the garage, and he stood there with his hand on the door frame and his back to the room, and nobody said anything. After a moment, Boyd stood up very quietly and moved to the sink and started doing dishes. No announcement, no performance. Just a big man quietly washing plates because the room needed something ordinary to happen in it. Crow stood and helped. Travis was still asleep. Jake stayed at the table and watched Daniel stand at the garage door. "I haven't opened this in 8 months, Daniel said. His voice was directed at the door, not at the room. "Last time I went in there, I sat on the floor next to the bike for about an hour. Didn't touch it, just sat on the floor." A pause. "Felt like an idiot." "Doesn't sound like an idiot to me," Jake said. "What does it sound like?" "Sounds like a man who wasn't ready but went in anyway just to see if he could." Daniel's hand moved from the door frame to the door handle. He held it. She bought me that bike, he said. Did you know that Carol saved for 2 years? Told me she was putting money away for a kitchen renovation we'd been talking about. The whole time it was for the bike. She handed me the keys on my 50th birthday in this driveway, and she was so proud of herself for pulling it off, for keeping the secret. She was practically vibrating. Jake's throat tightened. He didn't let it show. I wrote it for 9 months, Daniel said. 9 months, and then she was gone, and I put it away and I told myself I'd go back to it when I was ready. He let go of the door handle, turned around. His face was worn down to something very simple. I don't know if I'm ever going to be ready. I don't know if ready is a real place a person actually gets to, or if it's just something we say so we don't have to admit we've given up. It's a real place, Jake said, but you don't arrive there by waiting. Daniel looked at him. You arrive there by going, Jake said, even when you're not ready, especially then. The room was very quiet. Boyd had stopped doing dishes. Crow had his back to the counter and his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor, and even in the stillness of his posture there was something attentive, the posture of a man who is holding space for something without knowing what shape it's going to take. Daniel stood there for another moment. Then he turned back to the garage door and he opened it. The smell hit him first. Oil and metal and rubber and time, the smell of a garage that had been closed for years and had spent those years preserving everything inside it, holding it all in suspension like a sample in a jar. Daniel stood in the doorway and breathed it in and went somewhere private for a moment, somewhere behind his eyes, somewhere none of them could follow. Jake stood up. You don't have to, he started. I know, Daniel said. I want to. He walked in. Jake followed. Crow followed. Boyd dried his hands on a dish towel and came to the doorway, staying there with Travis, now awake, blinking confused on either side of him. The tarp was exactly what Emily had said. Gray dusty, pulled tight over a shape that anyone in that garage would have known anywhere. Daniel walked to it slowly. He put one hand on the corner of it, just held it there for a second, the way he'd held the door handle, not ready, but there. Then he pulled it off. The bike was exactly what Jake had remembered. Exactly. The dark navy blue, the chrome, the lines of it, it was a specific kind of beauty that only existed in functional things, the beauty of something that was built to do one thing and did that thing perfectly. It was also visibly neglected, not ruined, not destroyed, but clearly untouched. Dry. Waiting. Daniel put both hands on the handlebars. He didn't say anything. Nobody else said anything. He just stood there holding the handlebars of the bike his wife had saved 2 years to give him in the garage, where it had been sitting for 11 years, with 8 men he hadn't spoken to in 15 years, standing behind him, and the light going gold outside, and everything in the room balanced on the edge of something. It's not going to start, he said. Probably not today, Jake said. The battery's dead. The fuel lines are, I don't even know what state they're in. We can fix that. Daniel looked over his shoulder at Jake. I know engines, Jake said. So does Boyd. Give us a weekend. Daniel looked back at the bike. Something moved through him. Jake could see it from the posture, see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight change in how he was holding his weight. Why are you doing this? Daniel asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The same honest question he'd asked in the kitchen, but from a different place now, a softer place. And don't say because you owe me. I'm tired of people doing things because they owe people. That's debt. That's bookkeeping. That's not, he stopped. Why are you really here? Jake thought about it. He didn't reach for the easy answer. Because I was riding this morning, he said, and I didn't know where I was going, and then a girl told me her father had a bike like mine, and something in me that has been very quiet for a very long time woke up and said, this is the direction. This is where you're supposed to go. He paused. I have spent 15 years riding away from things. I think this morning I finally turned around. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then so quietly, Jake almost missed it. She used to say that, Carol. She'd say Jake always knows which way to point himself. She said that about you. Daniel's voice had gone private, internal, the voice of a man talking to himself as much as anyone else. Turns out she was more right than either of you knew. She just didn't specify it would take you this long. Something broke open in Jake's chest, clean and sudden like a window going up. He pressed his lips together and looked at the bike and didn't try to speak for a moment. It was Boyd who broke it, Boyd, who had no patience for emotions that went on past their natural length and who said from the doorway in his flat, practical voice, "I can get the parts we need by Thursday. I got a guy in Reno who keeps old stock." Daniel looked up at him. Boyd hadn't asked. Boyd had stated. "Thursday," Daniel repeated. "Might take Saturday to put it all together. Depends on the fuel lines." Daniel looked at Jake. Jake looked back at P. "Saturday," Daniel said slowly, like he was testing the word, like he was putting it in his mouth to see what it tasted like. "You don't have to decide right now," Jake said. "I'm deciding right now," Daniel said. He said it firmly. The firmness of a man who knew if he didn't say it fast, he'd talk himself out of it. "Saturday, you bring the parts. We'll see." "We'll see," Jake said. "That's not a commitment," Daniel said. "That's a we'll see." "A we'll see from you is worth more than a yes from most people," Jake said. Daniel looked at him. Something in his face did a complicated thing, tried to be stern, tried to hold the line and then failed quietly in the way that looked a lot like the beginning of trust, being rebuilt one careful brick at a time. "Get out of my garage," he said. There was no heat in it. They got out of his garage. Back in the house, Daniel moved around with more energy than he'd had all day. Small energy, purposeful energy, the kind that comes from a decision having been made. He gathered the blanket from Travis without comment and folded it. He refilled the coffee pot. He moved like a man who had remembered somewhere in the last half hour that he still lived in a body that was capable of moving with intention. Travis watched him from the corner with wide eyes and said nothing, which meant Boyd's instruction had taken hold. It was Jake's phone that changed the room again. It buzzed. He looked at it, and this time his expression shifted in a way that told Crow something was different. "What?" Crow said. Jake held up the phone, not showing the screen, just indicating it. "It's Emily." Daniel stopped moving. Jake answered. Put it on speaker without being asked something about the room, said this shouldn't be a private thing. "She there?" Emily's voice came through tight and careful. She was still at work. They could hear the background noise of the diner, the low clatter of it. "He's here," Jake said. "He's standing in his kitchen." A breath on the other end of the line. The sound of someone who had been holding something and just put it down. "Dad," she said. Daniel put his hands flat on the kitchen counter. He looked at the phone. "Emmy. You okay?" Yeah." He stopped. Started again. "I'm better than I've been in a while." A silence on the line. Then, "Did you go in the garage?" Nobody moved. "Yeah," Daniel said. Another silence. Longer. And then Emily Carter, 31 years old, standing in a diner in the middle of Nevada with a coffee pot in her hand, made a sound that she clearly tried to contain and couldn't, a small, sharp sound, the sound of relief that had been waiting so long it had sharp edges. "Okay," she said, and again, "okay," like she was confirming it to herself. "That's okay. Don't make a big deal of it," Daniel said. His voice was rough. "I'm not." "You're making a sound." "I'm not making a sound." "Emily." "I'm fine, Dad." The smile in her voice was unmistakable. "I'm completely fine. I spilled some coffee. It's fine." Boyd by the sink turned his face very carefully toward the window. Crow looked at the ceiling. Jake pressed his mouth together hard. "These guys are coming back Saturday," Daniel said, "to look at the bike." "Are they?" Emily said. Not a question. The two words of a woman who had been hoping for something for a very long time and was now standing inside the fact of it and didn't know what to do with her hands. "Don't read into it," Daniel said. "I'm not reading anything." "I can hear you reading." "I'm working, Dad. I literally can't." "I'll call you tonight," he said, and then before she could answer, "Thank you for this morning. I know you didn't. I know that wasn't easy." A pause. "It wasn't hard either," Emily said quietly. "Some things just need saying." Daniel nodded at the phone even though she couldn't see it. They hung up. The kitchen was still. But it was a different kind of still from when they'd arrived that morning. Not the still of a house with the air sucked out of it. The still of a room that had just been filled with something and was sitting with it. Daniel turned around and looked at the men in his kitchen. These men he'd hated and missed and tried to forget and never could, and he said, "I've got a neighbor's dog that gets loose and digs up my yard about twice a week. Man next door lost his wife last spring. His name's Gerald. He's 71. He paused. I've been meaning to go knock on his door for 8 months and I haven't done it. Nobody said anything. They all understood what he was actually saying. I'm going to do it tomorrow, Daniel said. I'm going to go knock on his door. Jake nodded. Because apparently I needed 8 at Bikers and my daughter's Tuesday shift to remind me what showing up looks like, Daniel said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite humor and wasn't quite sorrow. The compound thing that lives right between them, the feeling people call bittersweet because the language hasn't made a better word for it yet. You already knew what it looked like, Jake said. You showed up for me when I needed it most. You've always known. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. I forgot, he said simply. For a while, I forgot. That's what we're here for, Jake said, to remind you. The sun was going down by the time they said their goodbyes. Daniel walked them out. He stood in the drive as they put on their helmets and mounted up, and there was something in his posture that was different from the man who had opened the door that morning, straighter maybe. More present in his own body, like a man who had just had a lot of weight named out loud and found that named weight was lighter than unnamed weight had been. Jake was the last to start his engine. He looked at Daniel standing in the drive. Saturday, Jake said. Daniel looked at him for a moment, looked at the garage door, looked back. Saturday, he said. Jake put his helmet on. He started the engine. And as the bikes began to move down the gravel drive toward Route 7, Daniel Carter stood in his driveway in the last light of that Tuesday and watched them go. And for the first time in 11 years, the sound of engines leaving didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like a door left open. A door left deliberately, intentionally open, with the understanding that people were coming back through it. He stood there until he couldn't hear them anymore. Then he went inside, picked up the phone, and dialed a number he'd been avoiding for 8 months. It rang twice. Hello? An old man's voice, thin and uncertain, the voice of someone who didn't get many calls. Gerald, Daniel said. It's Daniel, from next door. I'm sorry I haven't called sooner. He paused. You want some company tonight? The silence on the other end lasted only a second. Yeah, Gerald said, and the word came out the way Daniel's will see had come out in the garage, weighted with more than its syllables could hold, carrying 11 months of silence, and 100 nights of sitting alone, carrying the particular relief of a man who thought he'd been forgotten and just discovered he hadn't been. Yeah, Gerald said again, I'd like that. Daniel grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door, and he walked next door for the first time in the 11 years since his wife had died, because a man named Jake Walker had driven 60 miles on a Tuesday morning, and because his daughter had been carrying something she shouldn't have had to carry alone, and because somewhere in the middle of all of it, Daniel Carter had remembered the most important thing a person can remember, that the only direction that ever actually heals anything is toward other people, not away from them. The garage door was still closed, but for the first time in a long time, he fully intended to open it again. Wednesday came the way days come after something significant, quieter than expected, slightly off kilter, like the world hadn't fully adjusted to the new shape of things yet. Daniel woke up at 6:15, which was 45 minutes earlier than he usually woke up, and lay in bed for exactly 3 minutes before he understood why. His body was awake because it had somewhere to be. Not literally nowhere was demanding his presence that morning, but something inside him had recalibrated overnight, some internal compass that had been spinning uselessly for 11 years, had found north again and was pointing, and the pointing was enough to get him out of bed at 6:15 on a Wednesday. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window. He looked at the garage door. He did not go in. That wasn't for today. But the looking was different from how the looking had always been. Not avoidance, not the flinching glance of a man checking to see if the thing he was afraid of is still there. Just looking. The way you look at something that belongs to you. He called Emily at 7. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. You never call before 9 on a Wednesday, she said. I woke up early. Are you okay? Stop asking me that, he said, not unkindly. I'm going to need you to stop making that your first question every time I call. I'm okay. I was okay yesterday. I'm okay today. A pause. Okay. I called Gerald last night. He heard her breath catch, and I went over there, stayed 2 hours. He's got a dog named Patterson, ugly little thing, half his teeth missing, and he made terrible decaf. And we watched a nature documentary about deep-sea fish, and neither one of us talked about our wives. He stopped. It was the best night I've had in a long time. Emily was quiet for a moment. Dad? I know, he said. I'm not going to make a thing of it. Good. Her voice broke slightly at the edges and she pulled it back together fast. I'm glad, that's all. Me too, he said, simply, completely. Me too. He hung up and finished his coffee and did something he hadn't done in years. He made a list, a small list. Nothing dramatic, just things he'd been putting off. The fence post in the back that had been leaning since spring. The gutters. The call to his doctor he'd rescheduled twice. Gerald's dog dug up the left side of the yard every time it got loose, and the left side of the yard could use something planted there anyway. Small things. The stuff of life is made of the ordinary maintenance of being a person in the world, which he had quietly let slide for so long, it had started to feel optional. It was not optional. He understood that now with a clarity that felt almost physical, like something inside his chest had been adjusted. He was halfway through the fence post when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Old habit, he answered. Daniel, a woman's voice, familiar in a way that took him 3 full seconds to place, and when he placed it, the shovel in his hand became very heavy. It's Margaret Reeves. Margaret Reeves. The name landed like a stone in still water. Concentric rings of implication spreading out from the point of impact. James Reeves had been the man at the center of what Jake called the situation. The thing Daniel had taken on the thing he had stood in front of, so Jake didn't have to. James Reeves was dead, now had been dead for 9 years, and with him dead, Daniel had assumed that particular chapter was permanently closed. Margaret was his ex-wife. She had known Daniel peripherally through the years of running with the club, the way the women in those circles knew each other well enough to recognize, not well enough to call. Margaret, he said. His voice came out neutral. He made it come out neutral. I heard you had visitors yesterday, she said. Something in Daniel went cold and alert the way it used to back when alertness had been a professional requirement. Word travels. Small world, she said. Somebody saw 8 bikes outside your house and mentioned it. To you. To me. A pause. I won't keep you long. I've been thinking about calling you for a while. And when I heard Jake went to see you, I figured it was time. Time for what, Margaret? There are things you don't know, she said, about what happened, about what James did after you took the fall, about what he told people. She stopped. About why the club really disappeared on you, Daniel. And it wasn't just guilt or fear. There was more to it than that. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. He was standing in his backyard with a shovel, and the fence post was still leaning, and everything had just shifted on its axis again. What are you telling me? He said carefully. I'm telling you Jake doesn't know the whole story either. Her voice was steady, the steady of a woman who had rehearsed this. James made sure of that. He told people things. After Carol's accident, when you were most vulnerable, he used that. He told people you'd gone unstable, that you'd said things about the club, that you were a liability. She paused. He poisoned the well, Daniel. That's why people stopped coming. It wasn't just guilt. They thought you'd turned. The shovel went into the ground and stayed there. He's been dead 9 years, Daniel said. I know that. Why didn't you say anything before? Because I didn't find out until after he died. I found it in his things, letters, notes. James kept records of everything. It was the thing about him that terrified me and ultimately ended our marriage. Another pause. I've been sitting on this for 9 years because I didn't know if it would help or hurt. And then I heard Jake went to see you, and I thought he should know. You both should know. The full story. Daniel stood in his backyard with the wind moving around him and 11 years rearranging themselves inside his mind, like furniture being moved in a dark room. People bumping into each other, hitting walls they hadn't known were there. He thought about all the men who had disappeared. He thought about the ones who had sent flowers. He thought about the ones who had never sent anything. And he thought about whether their silence had been entirely cowardice or whether some of them, most of them, had been told a version of him that was unrecognizable and had believed it because when you're grieving and unstable, the people who say you're grieving and unstable get more credit than they deserve. I need to see those letters, he said. I know, Margaret said. That's why I called. He made the drive Thursday morning, Reno was 3 hours north, and he made it in 2.5, which told him something about his state of mind. He hadn't driven fast in years. He hadn't driven anywhere with urgency in years. But his hands were steady on the wheel and his mind was clear in a specific way, the clarity of a man who has been handed a piece of a puzzle that changes the picture and can't unsee it. Margaret Reeves lived in a small house in a neighborhood that had seen better decades without being defeated by them. She was 68. She had been a striking woman once and was still striking in the way women get when the beauty shifts from surface to structure. She opened the door before he could knock, which meant she'd been watching for him, which meant she was as nervous as he was. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for calling," he said, meaning it. She made him sit at her kitchen table. A different kitchen table from a different life. But something about kitchen tables Daniel had decided in the last 72 hours was where the real things happen. Not living rooms with their careful arrangements. Kitchens, where people stood and moved and kept their hands busy and told the truth. She put a box on the table. It wasn't dramatic. It was a plain shoebox with a rubber band around it, the kind of thing that could have held tax documents or old photos or birthday cards. The ordinary container of extraordinary damage. "I've read through all of it," Margaret said, "multiple times. I've had 9 years to sit with what kind of man I was married to, and I've made my peace with it. But these are yours. You should have them." Daniel put his hand on the shoebox. "He admired you," Margaret said. Her voice was complicated, layered. "That was the sick thing. James genuinely admired you. You were everything he wasn't: steady, loyal, someone people trusted. And when you took the fall for Jake instead of him, instead of being grateful, she stopped, reorganized. He couldn't stand that you were the better man. He couldn't stand that people would know it. So he made sure they didn't know it." Daniel opened the box. The letters were exactly what Margaret had described: systematic, careful. The notes of a man who had approached character assassination the way someone might approach bookkeeping. Dates, names, specific conversations he had allegedly had with Daniel that had never taken place. A version of Daniel Carter built from whole cloth, designed to look just enough like the real thing to be believed. Daniel read slowly. He read 3 letters and then stopped reading because his hands had started to shake, and he needed them to stop before he continued. He put the letters down flat on the table. "Who got these?" he said. "Most of the senior members," Margaret said quietly. "Some of them probably knew they were being played. Some of them probably half believed it. And some of them," she looked at the table, "some of them maybe needed an excuse. Jake needed an excuse most of all." Daniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Jake loved you like a brother," she said plainly, which meant facing what he owed you was almost unbearable. James gave him a story, a different story, one where you didn't need help, where you were dangerous, untouchable, better left alone. It was easier to believe than the truth. Daniel absorbed that, took it in fully, turned it over. "He didn't know," Daniel said, not a question. "I don't think so," Margaret said. "I think Jake genuinely believed you'd retreated because you wanted to, that you'd closed the door. James was very good at what he did." The silence in Margaret's kitchen was long and comprehensive. "He was my friend," Daniel said, and the word friend came out scraped, depleted, wrung out. "I know," Margaret said. "I went to his funeral." "I know that too. I stood at that grave and I said things over it, about brotherhood, about what he'd meant to the people who rode with him." Daniel's voice was low and controlled the control of a man managing something that could, if mishandled, become something else. "And the whole time there was a box in his house that explained everything he'd taken from me." Margaret said nothing. There was nothing to say to that would help, and she was wise enough to know it. Daniel sat with it. All of it. He sat with the complexity of it, not just the betrayal, but the layers of it, the way it implicated people he'd chosen to hate for the wrong reasons and now had to reconfigure. He'd spent 11 years with a clean story. His brotherhood abandoned him. Simple, explicable. The kind of story that holds a grief in place so it doesn't move around and hurt you in new ways every day. And now the story had new rooms in it, rooms he hadn't known were there, rooms with different names. "Does Jake know any of this?" he asked. "No," Margaret said. "I called you first. I thought it was your story first. It happened to you. You should decide what to do with it. Daniel looked at the box. He's coming Saturday, Daniel said. To work on the bike. Margaret looked at him with an expression that contained approximately 11 different emotions, organized with great difficulty into something resembling calm. You're letting him come back. I already was, Daniel said. Even before this. He touched the edge of the box. This doesn't change that. Maybe it changes why, but not whether. She nodded slowly. I'm going to show him these, Daniel said. He needs to know. I thought you might say that. He spent 15 years carrying guilt that was partly manufactured, Daniel said. That doesn't just belong to him to carry alone. He deserves to know what he was actually working against. He paused. And I deserve to know that the men I thought chose to leave me, some of them, were lied to. The word lied to was important. He felt it settled differently from abandoned. Not lighter exactly, but different. The kind of different that left room for something other than pure damage. He drove back that afternoon with the box on the passenger seat, and he talked to it the way you sometimes talk to things that contain the presence of people who are no longer living. He said, I know you thought you were protecting something. I know you thought I was a threat to what you'd built. I know you were scared of what my decency said about your lack of it. He said it all to the box on the passenger seat, and then he stopped saying it because there was nothing more to say. And the road ahead was long and straight, and Nevada was enormous and indifferent and beautiful in its indifference. And he was a man driving north with the window down and the specific freedom of someone who has just been handed the full truth after years of living on a partial version of it. He got home at 4. He put the box on the kitchen table and he called Jake. Jake picked up on the second ring. Everything all right? I need to tell you something, Daniel said. Before Saturday, I need you to know something. A pause. Alert. Talk to me. Not on the phone, Daniel said. Can you come Friday? Another pause. Jake was recalibrating. Daniel could hear it in the silence the way you can hear a careful person thinking. I can come Friday. Yishim alone, Daniel said. Not the whole group, just you. Okay, Jake said. No hesitation, no demanding to know why. Just okay, the okay of a man who trusted the ask even before he understood it, which said more about who Jake Walker actually was than 15 years of complicated history. Come at noon, Daniel said. I'll make lunch. I'll be there, Jake said. Daniel hung up. He went to his bedroom and he opened the closet and he reached up to the top shelf behind a box of old tax returns and a broken alarm clock and a years-old paperback he'd never finished reading. He reached all the way to the back and he found what he was looking for. A photograph, 7 inches by 5, taken on a summer road somewhere in Utah, the sky behind them absolute and blue and enormous. 8 men on bikes, all of them younger, all of them with a particular blurred joy of people who have just ridden for 6 hours and stopped somewhere with a spectacular view and had someone's girlfriend take the photo because they wanted to remember this exact moment. Daniel was in the center of it. Carol had taken the photograph. You could feel her behind the camera, the way they were all slightly more alive in it than people usually look in photographs, which was the effect she had on rooms and moments and everything she touched. Jake was on his left, laughing, his head thrown back, teeth showing the laugh of a man without a single complicated thought in his head in that precise second. James Reeves was on his right. Daniel looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at the 3 of them himself, Jake, James, and he thought about how completely 3 people could understand each other and misunderstand each other at the same time. How you could stand on a mountain in Utah with someone and think you knew everything about them and be standing next to a version of them you'd never actually met. He put the photograph on the kitchen table next to the box. He stood back and looked at them together. Then he went to the garage. He didn't plan to. His feet just carried him there, the way feet sometimes know before the head catches up. He put his hand on the door handle. He breathed once. He went in. The bike was exactly where it had been when they'd pulled the tarp 2 days ago. In the low light of the garage, it looked like something that had been waiting very specifically, not collecting dust, not deteriorating, but waiting. Patient in the way only inanimate things can be because they have no choice. They just wait, and they do not mind the waiting, and they are there when you come back. Daniel crouched down beside it. He put his hand on the engine. Cold, still. but solid the engine of a thing that was built to run and had not forgotten how. He thought about Carol saving money for 2 years. He thought about her face when she handed him the keys. He thought about 9 months of riding before the world fell out from under him. He thought about Jake saying you don't arrive at ready by waiting, you arrive there by going. He stood up. He pulled the battery out and carried it inside and plugged it into the charger he had had on a shelf for years, still in the original packaging. He stood there in the kitchen, looking at the battery charger in his hand and thought, this is the most specific I have been in years. This is the most directed. This is me doing one precise thing that leads to the next precise thing that leads eventually somewhere I cannot fully see yet, but am willing to go. He put the charger on the counter and plugged it in. The indicator light blinked red twice and then went steady. He stood there and watched it for a long moment. Then he picked up the photograph from the table and took it into the living room and set it on the mantel face out where he could see it. Carol behind the camera. Jake laughing. The sky enormous. Everyone young and unaware of what was coming, which was not a tragedy. That was the thing he was only now beginning to understand. Not knowing what was coming was not a tragedy. It was just what it meant to be alive. He stood there looking at it until the light outside changed and it was time to start dinner. And in the kitchen on the counter, the battery charger blinked its steady light, patient and purposeful, doing its single job without asking for more than it needed. Friday was coming. And when Jake Walker walked through that door at noon and sat down at this kitchen table, Daniel Carter was going to put a shoebox and a photograph in front of him, and he was going to tell him the whole truth, and they were both going to have to figure out what you do when the story you've been living turns out to be the wrong story. He didn't know yet whether that would break something or build it, but for the first time in 11 years, he was willing to find out. Jake arrived at 11:58. Daniel heard the single engine coming up the gravel drive and felt something in his chest do a complicated thing, not dread, not quite anticipation, something compound and nameless that lived in the exact space between the two. He'd been up since 5. He'd made lunch twice, decided the first version wasn't right, thrown it out, started over. He'd moved the shoebox from the kitchen table to the counter and back to the table 3 times. He'd looked at the photograph on the mantel so many times the image had started to feel abstract, like a word you repeat until it loses meaning. He opened the door before Jake could knock. Jake stood there in the morning light with his helmet under his arm, and one look at Daniel's face told him this was not going to be a simple Friday. He didn't say anything. He just came in. Daniel had coffee ready. They sat. The shoebox was on the table between them, and Jake looked at it and looked at Daniel and waited. Margaret Reeves called me Wednesday, Daniel said. Jake went still. The particular stillness of a man who has just heard a name he didn't expect. Margaret, he said slowly. She found something after James died, letters, notes. Daniel's hand moved to the box but didn't open it. He kept records, Jake, of everything he told people. About me. After Carol. Jake said nothing. He told the senior members I'd gone unstable, Daniel said, that I'd said things about the club, that I was a liability. He looked at Jake directly. He built a version of me that didn't exist and handed it to everyone who might have shown up at my door. He made sure they had a reason not to come. The kitchen clock ticked. Jake's face had gone through 3 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds and had arrived at something that was very quiet and very dangerous and very internal. The face of a man receiving information that is reorganizing everything he thought he knew about a decade and a half of his own life. I didn't know that, Jake said. I know you didn't. Daniel, I swear to you, I know, Daniel said, and he meant it fully. I'm not telling you this to reopen a wound. I'm telling you because you came to my door on Tuesday carrying 15 years of guilt, and I need you to know that the guilt was real, but the story underneath it was contaminated. He paused. You were lied to. Most of them were lied to. The ones who stayed or away, some of them weren't cowards. They were deceived. Jake was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table and he was looking at them the way a man looks at things when he's actually looking at something else entirely. Something inside, something being dismantled and rebuilt in real time. He told me you said you didn't want contact, Jake said. His voice was low. Right after the funeral. He came to me, said he'd spoken to you, said you were clear that you needed people to back off, that reaching out would make things worse. He stopped. I believed him. I had no reason not to believe him. He was your brother, Daniel said. He was my brother, Jake said. And the way he said it, hollowed out, scraped clean, said everything about what it meant to discover that the person you trusted most had used that trust as a weapon against the person you trusted second most. Daniel pushed the box across the table. Jake looked at it. He didn't open it immediately. He put both hands on the sides of it the way Daniel had and held it, and Daniel understood he was giving himself a moment, the breath before the plunge. He opened the box. He read slowly. He read the way a careful man reads something that has consequences, not rushing to the end, not skimming for the parts that hurt, but going through it line by line methodically the way you'd want to read something that required you to be honest about your own part in it. Daniel watched him read. He watched Jake's jaw tighten on the third letter, watched his breathing change, watched the moment 3/4 of the way through a letter dated 11 years ago, 2 weeks after Carol's accident, when something in Jake's face simply gave way. Not dramatically, not loudly. The quiet collapse of a very strong thing under a weight it was never built to bear. Jake put the letter down. He pressed his fingers against his mouth. He looked at the ceiling. He breathed very carefully through his nose, the controlled breathing of a man who has made a decision about what he will and will not allow himself to do in someone else's kitchen. He wrote this 2 weeks after she died, Jake said. Yes. You were at your lowest point, and he was sitting somewhere writing this. Yes. Jake put his hand flat over the letter like he was covering it. I stood at his funeral, and I said he was the most loyal man I'd ever known. The words fell into the room, and neither of them did anything with them for a moment. So did I, Daniel said quietly. That landed. Jake looked at him, really looked the searching look of a man trying to understand how another man could have that kind of grace. How are you? He stopped, started again. How are you this calm about this? I'm not calm, Daniel said. I've had 2 days to work through the not calm part. I'm on the other side of it. Barely. He looked at the photograph on the mantle from where he sat, Carol invisible behind the camera, but present in the quality of light in everyone's faces. When Margaret called me, I stood in my backyard and I didn't move for about 10 minutes. I just stood there and let the whole story rearrange itself. 11 years of a story I thought I knew. And then I thought about what I was actually going to do with it. What did you decide? Jake asked. I decided that James Reeves being dead doesn't give me anywhere useful to put the anger, Daniel said. I decided that the men who believed him were deceived, but they were also some of them looking for a reason. People who really wanted to show up, don't let one man's word stop them. So the story isn't entirely clean. It's not purely victims and one villain. It's messier than that. He looked at Jake. And I decided that you showing up on Tuesday matters more than what kept you away for 15 years. Both things are true. I'm choosing to lead with the one that helps me. Jake looked at him for a long time. I don't know if I could do that. You don't have to, Daniel said. This is my life, my call. Another silence. Then Jake said, I'm going to find the men who were there when that letter was written, and I'm going to tell them what was in it. Jake. They deserve to know, Jake said. The quiet forcefulness of it was not anger, though it contained anger. It was something more purposeful. Not for blame, not to relitigate, but because some of those men buoyed a few others, they've been carrying their own version of Gao for 15 years. They thought they abandoned you. They thought they chose themselves over a brother. If some of that guilt was engineered, they need to know. He paused. Same reason you told me. Daniel looked at him. Same reason I told you, he said. Jake closed the box, carefully, with a finality that wasn't dismissal, more like a decision to close one door before opening another. Lunch, Daniel said. Jake blinked. The shift of gears was unexpected enough that it almost got a laugh from him. A real one, surprised the laugh of a man who had been pulled back from something heavy by something ordinary. Yeah, he said, lunch. They ate and they talked. And this time the talking was different from Tuesday, less careful, less structured, around the weight of what needed to be said, because most of what needed to be said had been said. They talked about roads they'd ridden and roads they hadn't. Jake talked about his daughter in Portland, who was studying to be a nurse. and called every Sunday whether he deserved it or not. Daniel talked about Emily about the Sunday calls that had started at 7 minutes and were now sometimes 40, about the ways she said things that were so precisely Carol's. It caught him in the throat every time, and he'd stopped trying to hide it from her because hiding it wasn't protecting her, it was just making both of them lonelier. When lunch was done, Daniel stood up without ceremony and said, "Come on." Jake followed him to the garage. The battery charger was still on the counter, the indicator now steady green instead of red. 2 days of patient, purposeful work, the battery doing its single job and now done. Daniel picked it up. He looked at Jake. Jake said nothing, just moved to the other side of the bike and crouched down ready. They worked for 2 hours. Boyd arrived at 2 with parts in a bag and didn't ask any questions about Jake's expression, which was the face of a man who had been through something and come out somewhere new. Boyd was not a man who asked about faces. He looked at the bike, said, "Let me see what we've got," and got to work. Crow came at 3. Then Travis, then the others, arriving in 1s and 2s, filling the garage with the noise of men doing a specific thing with shared purpose. The particular energy of people who understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is show up and be useful. Daniel stood in the middle of it and watched. He watched these men. His brothers, the word felt strange and right, simultaneously like a shoe that had been sitting unworn and still fit. He watched them work on his wife's gift to him, on this machine that had been waiting in suspended animation for 11 years, and he felt something move through him that was large and quiet and did not have a simple name. Travis was handing Boyd tools with the focused eagerness of a young man who understood he was part of something that mattered without knowing the full shape of what it was. At one point, he looked up and found Daniel watching him and said with the earnestness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious about earnestness, "My uncle used to talk about this kind of day. Just working on something together." He said there wasn't much better. Daniel looked at him, Tommy Travis's nephew, Tommy who would have shown up within a week, Tommy who was gone now, who had left this boy behind. "Your uncle was right," Daniel said. "There isn't much better." Travis nodded, went back to the tools, and Daniel looked away before the kid could see what had moved through his face. It was just past 5 when Boyd sat back on his heels and said, "All right, I think we're ready." The garage went quiet. Everyone looked at Daniel. He stood at the front of the bike. He put his hand on the handlebar. He looked at the engine, the one Carol had paid for with 2 years of redirected grocery savings and careful misdirection, in a delight in the secret she'd barely been able to contain. "You don't have to do it today," Jake said from the side. Same tone as Tuesday. No pressure, no performance. "I know," Daniel said. He reached down, his hand found the ignition, his thumb found the starter. He pressed it. The engine turned over and caught and died. He tried again. It turned, coughed, shuddered, and then, like something remembering what it was built for, it caught and held and roared, and the sound of it filled the garage and moved through Daniel Carter's chest like something physical, like the specific frequency that unlocks a specific door. And for a moment, he couldn't see very well, because the sound of that engine was the sound of a Saturday morning in spring 11 years ago, when Carol had handed him keys and been so proud of herself, she'd been practically vibrating. Nobody spoke. The engine ran. Daniel's hands were on the handlebars, and his eyes were closed, and the engine ran and ran and ran. And in the garage on a Friday afternoon in Nevada with 8 men standing witness, Daniel Carter sat with both the loss and the love of his life at the exact same time and did not try to separate them, because they were not separable, because the love was the reason for the loss, and the loss was the shape the love took now. And both of them were true, and both of them were his. He opened his eyes. He looked at Jake. Jake was looking back at him with an expression that was stripped of every layer. No road name, no history, no 15 years of complicated weight. Just a man looking at his friend and being glad simply and completely that his friend was still here. "Saturday," Daniel said. His voice was rough. "Saturday," Jake confirmed. Daniel let the engine run another full minute. Let it settle into itself, warm and steady, a thing restored to its purpose. Then he cut it. The silence afterward was the good kind, the kind that comes after something important, not the kind that comes from absence. He got off the bike. He stood up. He looked around the garage at these men, Boyd with grease on his hands and a rare softness in his face. Crow leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes bright. Travis trying unsuccessfully to look unaffected, the others arrayed around the space with the quiet satisfaction of people who had done something that mattered. I want to tell you all something, Daniel said. The garage was attentive. I spent 11 years being angry at the wrong story, he said. And I want to be clear. There are things that happened that were real and the damage was real, and I'm not standing here telling you it was fine. It wasn't fine. He paused. But I also spent 11 years letting that story be the only thing. And what I've understood in the last 4 days is that the story was never the whole thing. The whole thing was bigger. The whole thing included more people trying to do right by each other and failing at it in very human ways. He looked at Boyd, at Crow, at Travis, at each of them in turn. I'm done letting the wrong version of things take up the space the right version deserves. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Boyd said in his flat, unemotional way that meant he was in fact very emotional, "The fuel lines weren't as bad as I thought they'd be." A beat of silence. Then Crow laughed. Then 2 other men laughed. Then Daniel laughed, the real full laugh of a man who had found his way back to the part of himself that could do that, and it was the best sound in the garage by a significant margin. Saturday they rode. Not far, not the long run they would eventually take, not the highway stretching toward Utah where the mountain came up on the left and looked like it was painted on. That ride was coming. That ride had a date on it, now a real date marked in actual calendars. But Saturday they just rode the back roads around Route 78, bikes and 1 man on a dark navy blue motorcycle that had been under a tarp for 11 years and moved like it had never forgotten how. Emily was working the morning shift at Lou's when her phone buzzed. A photograph sent from her father's number. 8 bikes on an open road, the sky wide and clear above them. Her father at the center of the group on his bike, 1 hand raised, not a wave exactly. More like an acknowledgement. Like a man saying, I am here. I am in this. I am still alive inside myself, and I intend to stay that way. She stood in the middle of Lou's diner with a coffee pot in her hand and looked at the photograph and did not try to stop what happened to her face. Terrence came to the window. You okay out there? She looked up. She laughed the laugh of someone who has been worried for a very long time and has just been given something concrete to stop worrying about. Yeah, she said. I'm good. Coffee's getting cold, Terrence said. I know, she said. She looked at the photograph one more time. Then she put the phone in her pocket and picked up the coffee pot and went back to work because the world kept turning and the diner kept going. And some Tuesday mornings you say 12 words over a coffee pot and change the direction of everything. And somewhere on the back roads of Nevada, Daniel Carter rode his wife's gift to him into a Saturday morning with the wind against his face and 11 years of silence, finally completely irrevocably behind him. Not forgotten, not erased, but carried differently. Now the way you carry something when you've stopped carrying it alone. He did not ride away from the past. He rode forward with it into everything still ahead of him, and that made all the difference.